Welcome everyone, Franco here from Frank Analysis, and I am pleased to be joined by Caleb Maupin, socialist, activist, and journalist at RT. How are you doing today, Caleb?
I'm great. How about yourself?
Doing great. So Caleb, I found out about you recently thanks to recommendations from people on my Discord. And since then, you have become one of my top most watched content creators that I listen to on a weekly basis. You have a very strong understanding of not only Marxism, but history and tying these together, these experiences together to explain current events. I was very surprised to learn that you're only a few years older than me. You're like less than 7 years older than me. You speak as though you have an experience of somebody with a PhD with 20 years. So for people who are not subscribed to Caleb yet, we do have some mutual subscribers. But for those of you who are not subscribed to him yet, I highly recommend for you guys to subscribe. And before we get into your new book on Kamala Harris, why don't you go ahead and introduce to the audience about the work that you do and why you do it?
Well, I'm a journalist and a political analyst. I've been attracted to the ideas of socialism and Marxism since I was very young. I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I spent a long time building and working to build a socialist group. I've traveled to Iran, I've traveled to Venezuela, I've traveled to Russia. I've done a lot of writing. I've spoken at a lot of international conferences, and I would like to see a better world where people have access to what they need, where the standard of living is rising, and where the irrationality of greed and profits is no longer in command of society.
So your new book is titled Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, and there it is.
Yeah.
I've had my speculations on how dangerous of a president Kamala Harris would be based on her record as a ruthless prosecutor, her hyper-focus on identity politics while being illiterate on foreign policy, her campaign being filled with several former Hillary Clinton staffers, her support for online censorship, the corporately owned mainstream media propping her up tirelessly. I could go on and on and on about her, but when did you realize that you needed to write this book, and why did you get this urge to write it?
Well, someone who I don't want to name, but who's a rather prominent individual who's known in leftist circles, made a point of tipping me off about the fact that her father is a Marxist and is an economist and is an academic who has studied the writings of Karl Marx. They made a point of tipping me off about this, and the more I looked into this, the more I was just shocked, because more came out about Kamala Harris and her record as a prosecutor and the ruthless, evil things she did, the lives she destroyed, the lack of any remorse for doing it. But yet, her parents met at anti-war protests and civil rights marches at Berkeley. She attended this place called Rainbow Sign, which was a community activist, left-wing black cultural center in Berkeley. That's where she spent a lot of her childhood. And it disturbed me that a movement that I believe so much in, Marxism, socialism, the progressive movement, could produce someone capable of so much evil. And that pointed me to ask the question, because for a long time, whenever I traveled internationally, especially when I went to international communist gatherings, I would always get the same question: what's wrong with American communists? So I investigated Kamala Harris's life. I investigated who was backing her and who was supporting her. And I put together a short book, basically using Kamala Harris and her life and aspects of her life, and talking about Silicon Valley, talking about the Hillary Clinton State Department, talking about psychology, and getting into what I think is wrong with our movement, and where the left has kind of lost its way and how this can be fixed. So I use facts and unknown details about Kamala Harris to make wider points about American politics, fights in the ruling class, where the country is going, etc.
So in an article that you reported on in your video, and I also discussed in the video that I made on my channel, we brought up how the Biden-Harris transition team is filled with officials with ties to intelligence and Silicon Valley. The article is titled, "What Can Silicon Valley Expect from Joe Biden?" Since the propping up of the Russiagate conspiracy theory by the mainstream media and the Democratic Party, there has been a strong push for social media censorship and internet censorship in general. I always discuss how dangerous this is on my channel because of how this can be used against people on the left who challenge the establishment, since corporations control the media and they have their profit motive agenda, and they have potential to censor anything that goes against this agenda. So in your channel, as well as in Empire Files by Abby Martin, I've learned how our country has a history of suppressing and censoring people and movements with socialist and communist ideologies. So can you tell us more on the significance of this transition team and what this means for the future of our country going forward?
Well, it seems like Silicon Valley are our new tech overlords, right? I mean, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. I mean, this is the people who control the information that we have access to. Everyone's got a phone, it seems, and we're all getting information pumped at us every day on our phones. And there are some people that have access to information other people do not have. About the algorithms and about how information gets spread. It's been revealed that Facebook has these people called news curators that decide what stories go viral and what ones don't. It's been revealed that people get shadow banned, meaning that they're not banned. They're allowed to be on the platform, but they make sure they don't show up in people's news feeds. The algorithms are carefully manipulated to serve U.S. foreign policy goals. And during the Arab Spring, this was a particularly potent and dangerous tool. Because it was used to foment unrest, first in Tunisia and Egypt, later in Libya and in Syria and in other countries. And we are still dealing with the aftermath of what Hillary Clinton, the Hillary Clinton State Department, Twitter, Facebook, Google, what they all did in the year of 2011, which was they unleashed chaos and destruction for the purpose of securing the rule of Wall Street in the Middle East. And from what we understand, Barack Obama wasn't even aware of what was really going on. At one point, early in Obama's presidency, Hillary Clinton had a staffer by the name of Jared Andrew Cohen. He's somebody who worked for Google Alphabet. And he went to Twitter on behalf of the State Department and told them to act in certain ways that would help Twitter facilitate protests and unrest against the government of Iran. And Obama heard about this and, had not given permission for this to happen and tried to fire Andrew Cohen. And Hillary Clinton stepped in and protected him and bragged about this to the New Yorker. It's in the New Yorker. There's a whole thing about how Barack Obama didn't agree with what the Hillary Clinton State Department was doing, but she maneuvered behind the scenes to make things happen. After the coup in Honduras, right, the military toppled the elected government in Honduras. Barack Obama was asked about this coup, and he said, well, that's not legal. What he didn't know is that Hillary Clinton had been meeting with the coup plotters and planning to overthrow the government of Honduras. And now we have all these refugees coming on our border from Honduras, because ever since the government of Honduras was overthrown in 2009, the country has been a mess of instability and chaos. It has one of the highest murder rates in the world. According to some sources, it's the highest murder rate in the world. Free market country, looted by international corporations, people in poverty, people without running water, without electricity. They had a president, Manuel Zelaya, who was a socialist, who was trying to fix things. He's removed, and ever since then, there's been controversy. It appears the elections are being rigged to make sure no progressive gets back in. And Honduras is wrecked, thanks to the Hillary Clinton State Department. Just like Syria is wrecked, just like Libya is wrecked. Libya once had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. Now Libya is a disaster. I mean, a lot of the country doesn't have electricity. There are two competing governments fighting for power. ISIS and Al-Qaeda have set up shop. They have open-air slave markets. What the Hillary Clinton State Department did around the world was atrocious, but it was done with a left-wing cover. It was about the revolution. It was fighting against regimes. It was the people standing up. And Al Jazeera and Google and Twitter and Facebook manipulated and fomented chaos with propaganda and destabilized a number of countries. And this is very, very disturbing, because essentially the aesthetics and the emotions that leftists go for, right? Do you hear the people sing? Think about the musical Les Miserables, with the kids with their rifles or whatever. Those emotions, those aesthetics were hijacked to serve imperialism.
On your channel, you've discussed how our intelligence has different factions. I think in the CIA, I think you spoke of the John Brennan slash Obama faction, and then there's the Bush slash Pompeo faction. I remember you also spoke on another video about how Nixon was pressured by the intelligence community to step down because he was committing selfish acts that went against what they wanted. From what it sounds like, the intel had a preference for Biden-Harris this election over Trump. Trump, like Nixon, is a selfish actor. Although he is a billionaire and he is part of the elite club, he is not part of the political club within the elite. We oftentimes did see Trump expose truths about our government while he was president, like telling the truth about how we're in Syria for their oil, also famously exposing Jeb Bush and his family on the 2016 Republican primary debate stage, about the lies of WMDs to get us into the Iraq War. Every time Trump wanted to pull out troops out of a country, and this is no defense of Trump, he was still horrible on foreign policy, but whenever he wanted to pull troops out of countries, some news would drop about why we should stay in that country. An example is the Russia-Taliban Bountygate story. There's also a really good article by Caitlin Johnstone called "The Establishment Only Dislikes Trump Because He Puts an Ugly Face on the Empire." So I'm just going to read a small little quote from here, and then I'll ask you a question, Caleb. Caitlin Johnstone writes, "Establishment narrative managers understand how to skillfully manipulate public perception without being obvious about it. And they understand how easily an incompetent steward of empire can snap people out of their propaganda trance." Caleb, could you tell us the dynamics of the different factions of our intelligence community and why they more than likely preferred a Biden-Harris administration over another 4 years of a Trump administration?
Well, it's funny. I tell people that the CIA are kind of like producers in television, right? The producer, if you work in television or you work in TV, the producer doesn't do much, right? The producer doesn't write the story. The producer doesn't direct it. The producer doesn't film it. The producer isn't on air, right? The producer just makes everything else happen, right? They find the person to write it. They find the person to be on air. They find the person to film it, the cameraman. They get everything. They make everything happen. And if they do their job exactly right, no one knows they're there. But if they screw up, everybody knows they're there. That's how the intelligence community tends to operate. They don't pay for anything themselves. The Ford Foundation pays for it. The Rockefeller Foundations pay for it, right? They don't do anything themselves. They find proxies and useful idiots to do it for them, right? They just kind of make things happen subtly to push U.S. foreign policy goals. Now, for the most part, because that is a delicate art, it's the art of making friends and manipulating people and doing favors for people and getting people to act in certain ways without them really knowing what they're doing. The CIA tends to be liberal because they want everyone to like the United States. They want to be seen as just friendly and just helping people. So they tend to have an overall liberal perspective. In particular, the California wing of the CIA, right? The folks based out of the Stanford Research Institute. I talk about Marilyn Ferguson. I talk about the folks who did like crazy psychic research. There's kind of a hippy-dippy counterculture edge to the CIA. The CIA has ties to all kinds of weird, mystical Eastern cults and gurus. It did experiments with LSD and with drugs, and the CIA tends to be a liberal, kind of a hippie agency. However, there is a wing of the CIA that's a little more conservative. If you'll notice, the state of Indiana is not a big state, right? Indiana is a really small U.S. state, but it suddenly has a huge amount of influence in American politics, right? Mike Pence is from Indiana. Pete Buttigieg is from Indiana. Our newest Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, she's from Indiana. All of a sudden, Indiana is like at the center of American politics. It's an impoverished state. Why is that? Well, it's been revealed, a number of ex-CIA people have revealed that Notre Dame is one of the primary places the CIA recruits out of, Notre Dame University, right? Pete Buttigieg's father was the founder of the International Gramsci Society, which was an effort to, push Marxism away from the Soviet Union, had covert support. That was Pete Buttigieg's father. There was a church that in Indiana was the biggest church in the whole country, the Hammond Baptist Church, that was heavily involved in the Nicaraguan Contra War and running money and weapons to the Contras to fight the Sandinistas. The Indiana wing of the CIA tends to be more neoconservative, right? And that you'll notice that as soon as Trump came into office, he appointed Mike Pompeo head of the CIA. And he actually gave a speech at the CIA office where he was not very well received, right? Then he moved Mike Pompeo, a longtime CIA guy who's an evangelical Christian, up to being Secretary of State. And he moved Gina Haspel into the position of CIA director. Now, Gina Haspel is on record, or it's been exposed, it's been leaked that Gina Haspel is an advocate of torture. She believes in torturing people. Whereas, John Brennan, who was CIA director under Obama, made a big point of saying he would never torture anybody, and that if anybody ever asked him to torture, he would step down. He was going to oppose torture. He did not believe in torture. He would never torture anybody. And it seems like, the difference isn't whether the CIA tortures or not. I think the difference is, does the CIA want to be known as torturing people or not? And there's a particular faction that the Bush family, you'll remember during the Bush years, that's when, enhanced interrogation and all of that came out, right? The Bush family, Mike Pompeo, Gina Haspel, they represent a particularly conservative current within the CIA that believes it is in the interest of the United States to be known as a country that tortures people, right? Torture doesn't work. You don't get information from torturing people. That's not how it works, right? No, when people are being tortured, they tell you whatever you want to hear. Right? They'll just say whatever, right? And that it's not accurate information you get from them. They say what the torturer wants to hear, so they stop being tortured. However, torture does strike terror into people around the world. The notion that you can be tortured, right, and that you could be picked up and taken to a black site and tortured strikes terror into people, right? And I think that there is a particular faction in the CIA that thinks it would strike fear in the hearts of our enemies to be known as a torturing country, whereas most of the CIA wants, their job is to get the rest of the world to like the United States, to be soft power and friendly. So they want the United States to not be known as a torturing country, to be known as a super friendly, modern, woke, progressive, human rights-oriented country. And that's the main difference. And I think the majority of the intelligence community is with the Obama folks, whereas the Pentagon is pretty solidly, in the Trump camp. I think they favor a more peace through strength and threatening, intimidating look for the United States. So, I mean, there are these deep, divisions within the government apparatus, and they have long existed. Right. And there's different factions. One thing that's worth paying attention to is the Mormon Church, the Latter-day Saints. Right? You'll notice that Mitt Romney was the only Republican to vote to impeach Donald Trump, to remove him from office, right? He was the only Republican senator. And Mitt Romney is a Mormon. He represents Utah. Mitt Romney, you'll notice he has taken kind of an anti-Trump stance. The Mormons have a huge amount of support in the FBI and CIA. They are very well represented in both of those agencies. They have specific recruiting programs for those agencies, and they are pretty conservative. And you'll notice they have kind of gone back and forth about supporting Donald Trump, right? There was actually on the ballot in Utah in 2016, the Mormons ran their own candidate against Donald Trump. Evan McMullen, I believe, was his name, and he was on the ballot. And the idea was this former CIA guy, now college professor, was telling the Mormons were telling people not to vote for Trump in Utah, but to vote for this guy. Well, they changed their minds at the last minute, right? And the Mormon Church is a particularly big axis of influence in both FBI and CIA. There are different factions within the American deep state. I think that the biggest issue facing the American intelligence community right now is really neoliberalism, which is that most countries in the world, they have one secret security service, right? They have one CIA, FBI intelligence agency, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in the United States, we have the CIA, we have the FBI, we have the National Security Agency, we have U.S. Army intelligence, we have U.S. Naval intelligence. We have so many agencies, right? The NYPD has offices in every state, and they have an intelligence bureau as well. And that there is what you might call deep state overlap, right? There's so many different agencies all competing for money with each other. On top of that, you have to remember, because of neoliberalism, they're not all doing their own work, right? They're all contracting people to do it, especially when it comes to anything related to computers. They've all got private companies that they've contracted to do their work. And those private companies are trying to increase the amount of money they get, trying to increase their valuability. So there are so many different agendas within the American deep state, so many different factions that they all want money, they all want support, they all want to be the most important. And I think that is part of the crisis we're facing right now, as there are divisions in the ruling class. As you know, there's folks that are for Trump, and there's folks that are against Trump, and there's a lot of confusion and a lot of negotiation. And that's what we're facing here, is we're not all on the same page. I mean, that's the same problem we've had with the pandemic. I mean, when it came to how to deal with the pandemic, as a country, we're not all on the same page. And this is the crisis of what people refer to as late stage capitalism, right? Yeah. Different entities are pursuing their own profits in a reckless manner, and it leads to complete instability in society.
So are you at all familiar with the Great Reset?
I've seen some of that, and I don't want to get too conspiratorial about it, but I will say that it seems like big business has really been the main beneficiary of the pandemic. It's small businesses that are collapsing and falling apart, but Amazon is doing great, Walmart is doing great, and their competitors are all being rolled away. And if you look at Andrew Cuomo's plans for New York City, where I live, in the aftermath of the pandemic, it seems like Silicon Valley is going to, be running the city as well. A lot of the cameras in the city and contact tracing, and it seems like we're going to be living under a Silicon Valley regime here in New York City. A lot of New York City small business owners are very angry. The New York City Police Department is very angry. It appears they seem to be for Trump, while the elected government seems to be critical of the NYPD, and it is certainly for the Democrats. And this is a crisis of all of society.
Yeah. So just like for the people who don't know what it is, I just want to explain it real quick for them. And we're not at all trying to get in any conspiratorial realms here, but many rich nations have suffered economic turmoil after the pandemic. And again, I'm not pushing any conspiracy theories here about the virus being manufactured, but I think we can agree that it certainly is being taken advantage of by rich elites to push their agendas. So the Great Reset is not a conspiracy theory either. It is something that was talked about and supported openly on the World Economic Forum by Klaus Schwab, the executive chairman of the forum. Time magazine, which is owned by Mark Benioff, had the Great Reset on their front cover of the November 2020 issue of Time magazine. Benioff is also a co-founder of Breakthrough Energy with Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos. The Great Reset was also discussed and supported by England's Prince Charles, Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the UN, Kristalina Georgina, who is the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and other officials associated with Microsoft, credit card companies, and BP. So the Great Reset is about Klaus Schwab's release plan for how to overcome several economic and environmental crises that our world is currently facing. He provided details about his plan in an article on the Globe and Mail. And the three main components of the Great Reset agenda includes: number one, fair market outcomes; number two, investment in equality and sustainability; and number three, harnessing the innovations of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, the fourth industrial revolution includes omnipresent internet surveillance, which includes virtual reality and powered by 5G technology. This includes nanotechnology for physiological tracking, digital and trackable IDs, social mappings, and online social credit scores. Again, this is what he discussed. This is not anybody theorizing something. And as far as quality and sustainability, Schwab wants to increase deep sea mining in the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Oceans, and increase mineral mining in Africa. And in order to power artificial intelligence and 5G, these corporations are going to need a lot of minerals. And something I've often said in this show is that capitalism is tied to imperialism and overexploitation of natural resources. The problems with capitalism have certainly been exacerbated and highlighted in the recent months, but the solution that is proposed by the elites appears to be more technocracy, globalism, and authoritarianism. The Great Reset is a global revolution for capitalism, and I know you've heard that phrase before, Caleb. You spoke before about a book by Marilyn Ferguson that's titled The Aquarian Conspiracy: Personal and Social Transformation in the 1980s. Could you tell us more about the significance of this book, how this ties into a potential Harris administration? And do you see this at all related to the Great Reset that Klaus Schwab and these other elites keep talking about?
Sure. Well, Marilyn Ferguson is, she claimed to be like a psychic medium. She was an occultist, and she advised a lot of Democrats, right? She was an advisor to Ted Turner, the cable giant who started CNN. She was a spiritual advisor to Al Gore. She actually was invited to the White House during the 1990s to do psychic stuff at the White House. And she's a strange occult figure who became popular over the course of the 1970s. However, what needs to be discussed is her ties to the intelligence community, right? In her book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, in which she lays out her worldview, it's a manifesto, basically. She names a number of think tanks that are involved with her efforts and share her perspective. And they include the Stanford Research Institute, which is a very important CIA-linked research institution in California. She talks also about, some other foundations. I think one's called like the Center for Democratic Studies or something like that. And it's been revealed that she and others were actually contracted by the CIA in their research of psychics and things like that. But what's important is that at the same time that Silicon Valley, at the same time that Marilyn Ferguson was rising in influence and becoming popular among CIA-linked people, like Carl Rogers Carl Rogers was a psychologist who, started out working with the CIA and their brainwashing research, and then became kind of the most prominent, psychologist in the United States. Buckminster Fuller, others, at the same time that Marilyn Ferguson is becoming kind of the ideological guru for all the CIA-linked intellectuals and academics and politicians. At that same time, they're setting up Silicon Valley, right? This is the late 70s, early 80s, and it's really because of money from the NSA and money from the CIA and money from the intelligence agencies that Silicon Valley became the center of the computer revolution. Right? It was not the free market that created Silicon Valley, right? This is a myth that we are constant hear. Steve Jobs was just tinkering around in his garage and he was creative and he had this idea and the free market made it happen. That's not true, right? That there was a strategic decision made by America's intelligence agencies. Go back to the 60s. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Cold War strategist, wrote a book about the role of computers potentially, and it was discovered that the Soviets did not have anywhere near the amount of resources to invest in their computer field. And they were very advanced in computers. They developed their own computer system in the 80s, home computer system. They were very advanced in computers, but they didn't have the resources to keep up with the United States. And because of that, a strategic decision was made by the U.S. government and its intelligence wing to start, pouring money into IBM and Apple and what eventually became Google and what eventually became the internet. And, Al Gore is quoted as saying, "We invented the internet." What he meant was the U.S. government made strategic decisions to give money to people, to develop the tech sector. That's what that was really referring to. And because of that, right, Silicon Valley, California, you talk about Palo Alto, California, places like that, they became the center of the computer revolution. And that's at the same time that Marilyn Ferguson is writing, and is considered the spiritual guru of all of this. And if you read her writings, she does talk about, what she might call a great reset. I mean, she doesn't use those words, but she's talking about this great, spiritual awakening that's going to spread all over the planet. It's not pro-communist. It's not anti-communist. It's just about awakening mankind. Right. It's going to reduce the human population. It's going to reduce consumption. And we're going to come into balance with Mother Nature. And we're going to go back to pre-Christian values. She feels like monotheism and Christianity and Islam and Judaism are like distortions. There's these natural faiths. We're going to go back to the pagan ways that existed. And we're going to be in balance with Mother Nature. And it's quite disturbing if you read it. It's written in a very upbeat, positive tone. But if you actually read the content of what she's writing, she's calling for a fomenting of global chaos and instability in order to just kind of reset the planet. So I can see what you're getting at it and how they might be related.
Yeah, it's really scary. So is this? Do you see any ties with this at all in trying to suppress people who have socialist ideologies or communist ideologies? I mentioned earlier that you talked before on your channel about the history of this and how in Hollywood, um, they try to suppress people who believed in communism.
Sure. Well, I mean, the thing is that the main way that actual Marxism has been suppressed, the main way it's been suppressed is by supplanting it and replacing it with what I call the synthetic left. In the 1950s, there was McCarthyism, and that was about beating down the Communist Party USA, draining them of their influence, and communists went to prison. There was the Hollywood 10, a number of Hollywood screenwriters who went to prison for refusing to name names, and anyone who was known to be a communist, you couldn't work in Hollywood. That happened, right? People were blacklisted. The Communist Party USA, they all went to prison. A lot of their leaders went to prison under the Smith Act in 1948. They were convicted, and that was the beginning of the 1950s, right? But later, as it became clear that the U.S. government needed to negotiate with the Soviet Union, as it became clear that many people would remain communists and all of that, what started going on was a program called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And that program was essentially the U.S. government covertly funding leftists and covertly funding people who called themselves socialists or were critical of capitalism, but nudging their views in a different direction, right? Trotskyites who opposed the Soviet Union, thought the Soviet Union was an evil Stalinist regime, got lots of money to build their organizations, right? Susan Sontag and Irving Howe, and a lot of these names that went on to become very, very prominent in left-wing circles. They were people that were selected by the intelligence agencies to be the voices of leftism. And they gradually worked to change the socialist movement from a movement that wanted chaos and was like fighting for working people, or, changing it from a movement that wanted stability and wanted to improve the lives of working people and build mass working class organizations, to being kind of a movement of intellectuals that want instability and chaos for their own ends. There's many different examples that you can point to. I mean, for example, Gloria Steinem, right? Gloria Steinem was the household name, the founder of Ms. Magazine, the feminist, of the 1970s. She went on to establish and help found Democratic Socialists of America. Well, Gloria Steinem, if you look at her history, she brags about the fact that she was a CIA operative in her memoir. She worked for the CIA, and she actually went to their the Communist Youth Festival in Vienna with a number of other CIA young people, and they set off smoke bombs and disrupted events and tried to just cause problems at this Communist Youth Festival. And one of the people she went to this youth festival with was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who ended up being National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, and Barney Frank, who ended up becoming a member of Congress from Boston. They went to this festival and with CIA instructions, kind of wreaked havoc in the early 60s. And Gloria Steinem says that her years with the CIA, she found them to be a liberal, pacifist organization. That there was a huge effort to manipulate left-wing politics and to maneuver left-wing politics to not really be about building a mass populist working class movement to build a better world for working people, but to instead be, kind of a movement, giving people permission to release their impulses and, protecting intellectuals from the mob, right?
Mm-hmm.
The idea that average people are inferior rabble, but there are these intellectuals, these smart people. And whenever the average, ordinary people start getting together, that's the same thing as fascism. That's the same thing as Hitler. So you need to manipulate the average people, control them, and make sure they never start fighting for their rights, and to make sure that we have an open, liberal society where the intellectual is protected from the inferior rabble, control the rabble, make sure they don't breed too much, give them all kinds of razzle-dazzle and drugs, and just control the rabble and protect this kind of superior group of intellectuals who rule over us. And interestingly, that's the view on Silicon Valley as well, right? Malthusianism is very popular. Ayn Rand and her view of the world, right? I mean, objectivism, right? The notion that there are these great men who are the motor of the world, and they need to be protected from the rest of humanity that would hold back their greatness. This kind of elitist, controlling viewpoint, technocracy is a word you used. I think that's a good way of putting it. That kind of viewpoint is pretty big in those circles, and the manipulation of left-wing politics to be about that, and not what Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and Eugene Debs and Gus Hall were talking about, to be about this kind of strange protection of the individual while holding back the broad masses. That distortion of left-wing politics is the primary way that the intelligence agencies have worked to counter any real socialist mass movement in the United States.
Yeah, when you talk about the synthetic left, some people come to mind. We don't have to name any names in terms of independent media, but I think there certainly are some political figures as well that have appeared. I can only imagine how lonely it must have felt for you before 2016, when there were more people that woke up about what socialism really is and how it's not that scary. But have you noticed that there's a lot more synthetic left, or is this something that was always there?
Well, I mean, as I said, whenever I would go to international communist gatherings, people would always say to me, "What's wrong with American communists?" Right? Mm-hmm. And as there was always a problem. Okay, in the organized left. I first got active around the Iraq War. I protested the Iraq War. And, that was communist groups mainly that were involved in that. And they always had problems. They were very dysfunctional and confused, but it was at least communist groups. But in the lead up to 2016, we're talking like through the Obama years, things in the socialist movement and the socialist left started to get really, really weird. Every socialist space I ever went to started having these purge trials, basically. Somebody said something that was transphobic. Somebody said something that was this. Somebody liked the wrong celebrity on social media. And everywhere I went in the socialist movement, there were just these bizarre purge trials. The transgender issue. If you did not sign on, and a lot of working class people, that is not something they're thinking about. Okay, and if you did not immediately sign on to everything the transgender movement said, immediately you were a fascist, you were a Nazi, you had to get kicked out. And then suddenly I started to hear about tankies, right? And tankies are bad. Don't be a tanky. And then I started suddenly to hear about Nazbols. I was called a Nazbol. I didn't know what a Nazbol was. I was told a Duganist. I don't know what a Duganist was, right? But the memo got sent out that if you're a leftist who actually opposes U.S. wars, who doesn't support the U.S. government overthrowing Assad in Syria, who didn't celebrate when Gaddafi was murdered, you're not really a leftist. You're a fascist, and you're part of this. You're part of these people that are bad, that are red browns, that shouldn't be welcome in left-wing spaces, and should get beaten up and escorted out anywhere they go. And it's weird. There's been a huge effort, as left-wing politics has really been growing, because it has. I mean, since the rise of Bernie Sanders, things have really been rising. Left-wing politics has really, really expanded. Because of that, suddenly left-wing spaces are being very, very carefully controlled. And, just the basic anti-war, anti-imperialist instincts are no longer being tolerated. And there is just a demand that everyone sign on to this new woke ideology that says we want chaos and destruction, and anyone who wants order or stability is a fascist, is a Nazi. There's been a huge effort to confuse left-wing circles. I mean, Jacobin magazine came out of nowhere. No one had any idea where that came from. But when it came out, I noticed MSNBC did a whole segment on, I think it was All In with Chris Hayes, just to promote, there's just a socialist webzine opened up, let's find out about it, right? Now it's been revealed, interestingly, that Jacobin magazine, one of their primary funders, is something called the Jewish Communal Fund, which is an Israeli lobby group that operates on American college campuses. Now, it's a liberal Israeli lobby group. It's not, pro-Likud. It's more in line with the Israeli Labor Party. But the main voice of socialism that was just, declared the voice of all socialist politics, they set the tone, is an entity that's basically funded by a proxy of the Israeli government in the United States. I mean, and this is on their tax forms. It's not a secret, where Jacobin magazine gets their funding, and that there's been a huge effort to make sure that the movement, it's rising. People are hungry in the United States. People are mad about the police state. There's a huge effort to make sure that movement that is rising does not become a real socialist movement, that it becomes just an extension of the Democratic Party and its kind of turf war with the Republicans.
And if you point that out about who funds Jacobin, they call you an anti-Semite, even though it's just stating a fact. It's not like it's not you being anti-Semitic.
Meanwhile, people constantly bait me about the fact that I work for RT, right? I work for a company that's from Russia, and that's supposed to make me evil and untouchable. But these folks work for a U.S. imperialist-aligned country, a settler colonial state that is condemned hugely around the world for its violation of the rights of Palestinians, but you're not even allowed to say it or you're an anti-Semite. but no one should ever listen to anything I say because I work at RT. I mean, this is the double standard, and it's what it is it's a pro-imperialist bias. These people are supporters of Western imperialism. You know, the fascist right-wing Proud Boys. One thing that they chant at their rallies, they chant, "The West is the best. The West is the best." That's what these people believe. When it really gets down to it, they believe that, you know, the United States may not be perfect, it has problems, whatever, but we're the best, right? We're way better than China, we're way better than Cuba, we're way better than Venezuela, we're way better than all those countries. And if we could just expand the freedoms that the United States has all over the world, that would be a step closer to socialism. This is classic social imperialism, right? These are the ideas of Edward Bernstein. These are the ideas that led to World War I, as the various socialist parties started supporting the war and lining up workers to kill other workers. This is social imperialism, and it's an effort to try and control what they see coming. People are ready to hear about real socialism, and they know it, and so they're trying. This is an effort to make sure that the rising that's coming is controlled and doesn't lead to anything really good.
So I just want to double back to our conversation about Kamala. Now that Trump is gone, how would this change the system of the ruling class and their long-term goals? Do you see people's livelihoods getting exacerbated by by the gig economy, which is an extension of what they might continue to do? And was sparked by the Obama administration. I know that 94% of new jobs that were created under Obama were gig economy jobs like Uber, Postmates, dog walking apps, etc. And I think I've heard you mention before about how this was a setup to help Hillary Clinton and or Biden win in 2016. Is that right?
Well, one thing that's interesting is Kamala Harris's brother-in-law is the chief lawyer for Uber, right? So she has a direct tie to Uber and its profits, right? And here in New York City, I mean, we've had cab drivers commit suicide because of Uber, right? You know, Uber pays a lot less. People take Ubers, they don't take yellow cabs, and people have worked for years to get a medallion, to get, you know, the New York City cab driver, you know, ability to make a decent living at that, and now it's all gone to nothing. And there's been suicides, and you know, this is about building a more high-tech, mechanized economy. And this is the contradiction of capitalism. In a rational society, technological advancement would be great. There'd be less work for everyone to do. Under capitalism, though, workers can only work so long as they sell their labor power. And the more technology the capitalist has, the fewer workers he needs, right? He replaces workers with machines. And so fewer people are hired, and there's more unemployment. And on top of that, the machines make the jobs that those workers do less skilled, right? So the workers are easily replaceable, so they get paid for even less. Right. And but then there's a little bit of a problem, which is that, you know, machines do not produce surplus value. Right. The machine has the same cost. You can't extract surplus value from a machine. So the rate of profit that the capitalist can make, the rate of profit goes down. The fewer workers that are involved in production. So the capitalist is seeing, while his profits are rising, his rate of profit per commodity is decreasing. He's going to make his profit margin is going to go down on every commodity. And so this leads us to a bigger crisis where, again, you have all these commodities that can't be sold. The market is glutted. You know, we can churn out iPhones and iPads and you know, all kinds of things better and more efficiently than ever before, but the people are hungry and poor and can't afford to buy them. And on top of that, the rate of profit that the capitalist is making on selling them goes down, and this all leads to an economic crisis. This is what Karl Marx's book Capital is really about. It's about how technology and the drive to innovate and revolutionize the means of production. Under capitalism, it leads to mass poverty and it leads to an economic crisis. And this is a naturally unstable system because of this problem of overproduction and the general law of capitalist accumulation. And the only way it can really be resolved is for a state to centrally plan the economy so that rational human reason dictates production, not the profits. We need a government rooted in communities, a government that represents us, the working people, to take control of the banks, factories, and industries and reorganize the economy to serve the people and not the profits of the few, right? Production for profit is capitalism, but when production is organized upon a predetermined plan, That's socialism. And China has been very successful with a socialist system, right? It was socialism in China that made China at this point the second largest economy in the world, raised 800 million people from poverty. It's socialism that now has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, Huawei Technologies, which is a profit-sharing cooperative set up by the Chinese government, technically private, but it basically does what the Communist Party and the military of China tell it to. It's not a free market entity. And there's many other examples of this, that when countries can break out of the free market and they can start to organize and rationally plan their economy, they can raise people out of poverty and they can operate in a much more efficient manner. Socialism is much more efficient than capitalism. It is much more efficient to have the economy centrally planned than it is to have every capitalist doing whatever they want. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this disaster facing us, especially amid a pandemic.
Yeah, and I'm going to have an article linked for people to look at about Kamala Harris's brother-in-law, Tony West, by Business Insider, the life and career of Tony West, the Uber executive married to Kamala Harris's sister, and who may be in the running for a role in the Biden administration. So that's not looking good for the gig economy. Like he might actually have a position in the administration. So you spoke in a video about the connections of the Hillary faction of Obama's administration, and how it had connections with Silicon Valley. More specifically, people in Google and Facebook. These entities helped cover up truths about the Arab Spring. Hillary's campaign staffers went on to work in Kamala's campaign. How dangerous do you see a Harris administration covering up imperialist behavior on foreign policy, seeing as how Biden has said that he's not going to serve a full 4 years? What do you foresee our foreign policy going forward?
Kamala Harris, people want to call her a psychopath. She's not a psychopath. She's not a sociopath. Kamala Harris is a narcissist, right? And we need to be careful about that. There's this tendency among younger people. They want to say, well, everyone they don't like is a sociopath. Everyone's a psychopath. She's neither of those things, right? Sociopaths, psychopaths have very little emotion, right? They have no empathy, very little emotion. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, is a very, very, very emotional person. No candidate in American history that I have ever seen has invoked their own childhood as much as Kamala Harris has. Kamala Harris sells T-shirts with her 10-year-old self on them. Yeah. Kamala Harris, in almost every speech, talks about how that little girl was me. She used to be a small child. She experienced discrimination as a child. She had a hard life as a child. Kamala Harris really feels sorry for herself. I mean, she feels like she has gotten an unfair shake in life, and she probably has. There's probably a lot of truth in that. She was one of the first children to integrate schools in Berkeley and in Oakland, California. There was a very ugly divorce in which her father and her mother separated. She glosses over it in her autobiography, but it's been revealed there was a very ugly custody battle. She was basically estranged from her father. Kamala Harris has had a lot of hardship in her life, okay? And the anger that you see, Kamala Harris is like, trademark is that anger, that prosecutorial anger, where her voice reaches a crescendo when she's condemning somebody, right? And that anger is driven by a very, very personal feeling that she has gotten an unfair shake in the world. And that anger and that feeling that she has about herself has given her the ability to not feel remorse for some very evil things she has done. For example, there was an individual on death row in California. He was facing lethal injection. And the governor of California said, we really ought to get DNA evidence to make sure he's really the guy who did this before we kill him. Kamala tried to stop it. No. She tried to block DNA evidence. Well, she didn't succeed. But you have to ask yourself, what kind of person would be so desperate to kill someone that they wouldn't want to make sure that they're the person who actually did it? They would try to prevent acquiring all the evidence. But the thing is, Kamala's not worried that she'll have that on her conscience for the rest of her life. It's not something that bothers her, right? The fact that throughout her prosecutorial career, as she rose up to be Attorney General in the Bay Area, and then Attorney General or District Attorney in the Bay Area, and then California Attorney General, frequently there were situations where judges were calling out her and her office for withholding evidence, right? basically, there's evidence that might point to someone being innocent, so trying to withhold it and make sure that the defense doesn't get their hands on it because you don't want an innocent person to not go to jail. Prosecutorial misconduct. I mean, there was a drug lab that was revealed to have, be giving people positive drug tests when they were actually not, positive, and they didn't reveal this, right? So all kinds of people were convicted on the basis of a positive drug test that came from a drug lab that was giving false results, right? And she, Kamala Harris, didn't think she had a moral obligation to come forward and say this is false. This is a person who is really, really, really deranged, okay? But the thing is, how does she justify it? Well, listen to every speech. That little girl was me. It's all about her and her own suffering. She's looking inward. She's feeling sorry for herself. She's angry at the world. She's full of rage. She wants to destroy. And a person like that is that upset and that unstable is very easy to manipulate. And there are all kinds of people in our intelligence agencies and in Silicon Valley that are, the kind of people who have the job of going around the world and overthrowing anti-imperialist governments, right? Mm-hmm. And the job of those people is to get, presidents and vice presidents and world leaders to do what's in line with the overall agenda. One great example during the Obama years was Obama didn't want to bomb Libya, right? I mean, he'd been supporting the rebels and all of that, but he didn't want to start a new war. He didn't want to bomb Libya. So it appears that individuals within his administration, including Samantha Power, including Cass Sunstein, they went to Obama and they said that Gaddafi had been saying that when he retakes a certain city, he's going to be going house to house, right? Now, what does that mean? It means, he's going to be searching for finding who the rebels are and arresting them or whatever. But they told Obama over and over, Gaddafi is going to kill every person. When he said go house to house, he is going to kill every person. Obama, if you don't stop this, if you don't take action right now, there's going to be a massacre in Benghazi, and it'll be your fault. He announced he's going to go house to house. He's going to murder everyone in Benghazi. Obama, you have to stop it. And you'll notice when Obama started sending the cruise missiles to Syria, he said we have to stop a genocide. Well, there was not going to be a genocide. Most of the people in Benghazi supported Gaddafi, right? That was not true. But it was about how they knew how to push Obama's buttons. Well, Kamala is somebody who is going to be way easier to push her buttons. She's somebody who already is without remorse. She's somebody who's already full of rage and a desire to harm other people. And it is going to be very, very easy to push Kamala's buttons and get her to take revenge for that little girl who was her. And that's why we should all be very worried. Kamala Harris, they would put the nuclear button in front of her and tell her, get her mad enough and she'll push the button, right? This is an unstable person who's got a lot of unhealthy rage. And that is why we should be concerned, right? I mean, and what's interesting is that, I begin the chapter in my book on this, where I actually talk about the fact that our last four presidents all had very similar personalities, right? Trump and George W. Bush have a very similar life story, a very similar relationship with their fathers, a very similar, growing up and similar personalities. Bill Clinton and Obama, there's some eerie similarities there about how they were both raised by single mothers, had abusive stepfathers, both learned at young ages that they were very charismatic, ended up going to Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League schools. There are certain weird parallels between our leaders, and if you study personality theory, this stuff is very important. You have to remember, people aren't studying the personality of me or you, right? But the person who's going to be the president of the United States, right? There are billions and billions of dollars and billions of lives on the line by the decisions that they make. So people are going to study them, like a murder case. People are going to figure out exactly how to convince them to do what they need to do, right? The psychology and the personality profile and the tendencies of a person in that position are something that you can bet every CIA, intelligence agency, think tank, they're all studying that extensively. How do we get this person to do what we want to do? And Kamala's life story, right, with the problematic, the marriage falling out, anger at the father, that's Samantha Power's life story, that's Amy Klobuchar's life story, and if you look through the Hillary Clinton State Department, that's a very common story, right? Women raised by a mother, hating their fathers, the father beat the mother, right? The father was an alcoholic. It's the same story, right? And that this is a personality that certain people have learned how to manipulate. And it's a personality that they have kind of attached to in order to get things done. That people with those kind of issues are really good at being in the liberal wing of the foreign policy establishment. That's been figured out, and it appears that now we're going to have a vice president and potentially a president who is somebody who it appears has enough lack of remorse and enough rage and enough childhood trauma that they can be manipulated in a way that is very dangerous.
Yeah, and a lot of the American people got to hear about, her record in July of 2019 when Tulsi Gabbard exposed her record. It was certainly very satisfying for me to see that, and I'm sure it was for you as well, since we knew more about Kamala Harris. But I hope that people don't forget that once she becomes our VP and she goes on to be our president. This is a woman. Yeah, go ahead.
That Tulsi Gabbard blow, that was like the most epic political knockout in U.S. history.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Tulsi Gabbard had very limited time. She used her time. She said what she needed to say about Kamala Harris, and Kamala Harris was down for the count. The CNN was so desperate to get Kamala out of that they gave her a chance to respond after the debate, and she's sitting there, and Anderson Cooper says, wow, Tulsi Gabbard said all of this about you. Any response? Like, please refute this. Please say it's a lie. Please say it's not true. And Kamala is just like, well, Tulsi Gabbard likes Assad or something. And she had no response, right? And
she couldn't deny
it.
it.
Everything Tulsi Gabbard said was absolutely true, right? And Kamala Harris gave no response. And you'll notice after that, she had been like a favorite or something.
Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris got less than 1% of the vote in the Democratic
She was polling
primary.
less than Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah. It was, the public heard that. They had seen Kamala Harris and her angry shouting and her, I'm going to be mean and prosecute people and punish people for you scene. And then Tulsi Gabbard just said, oh, just so you know, this is how she uses her power. A few short sentences, less than a minute. Boom. She was down for the count. It was an epic political knockout, right? The American people heard that and they said, we aren't voting for her. We are not going to vote for her. It worked. But it didn't matter because she was able to maneuver her way back onto the Democratic ticket, and the forces that wanted her arranged for her to become the vice president. And now, even though less than 1% of the Democratic primary voters voted for her, she is probably going to be president very soon. And that shows how democratic the United States really is in some ways.
Yeah, well, at least that clip exists to remind people, because Bernie Sanders was not going to expose that. No one was going to touch her on that. And it's funny that you bring up how she brought up like Assad. That's like something that Pete Buttigieg also brought up when Tulsi went after him. That's like their go-to thing is always to associate her with Assad or Modi.
But you'll notice
really
they did the same thing to Bernie Sanders, right? Mm-hmm. Did you notice that as Bernie Sanders was polling really well, all of a sudden the story became Bernie Sanders loves dictators. Bernie Sanders loves Cuba. He loves the Soviet Union. All of a sudden, the New York Times just mysteriously got their hands on these old KGB files of the KGB, and they didn't say anything. It just said that he visited the Soviet Union and they investigated him or something. But they made it a front page story. The KGB has files on Bernie Sanders. It was very interesting. And when Joe Biden was thinking about picking another VP, you'll remember, right? Karen Bass from Los Angeles, right? When Joe Biden was thinking about picking her, all of a sudden, the fact that she had gone to Cuba in the 70s with the Venceremos brigades and all of this information about her being allegedly tied to the Cuban government just mysteriously found its way into the press. Where do you think this is coming from? Right? I mean, it's so obvious what's going on here. People think we have a free and open media in the United States. We don't. There are forces behind the scenes that very effectively manipulate things to serve the goal of destabilizing the world, fomenting chaos and unrest to make sure that Wall Street and London stay at the center of the global economy.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it might get worse with the people who are going to be in the administration of Biden and Harris and how they have ties to Silicon Valley and in the intelligence community. And I don't see a solution in electoral politics alone. Both main parties, they seem irreformable to me. Both are capitalists and they're owned by corporate elites. Even the most quote-unquote progressive politicians like Bernie Sanders and AOC seem to bow down to the establishment, and they do not seem to be true socialists. They voted for the CARES Act. They are also silent on foreign policy, or often they give CIA talking points like deferring to caucus leadership on Venezuela, or arranging to attend a eulogy event for the Israeli war criminal Yitzhak Rabin. I don't know if you heard that one. They are absolutely silent on Julian Assange. And I am a proponent of a peaceful revolutionary action. That's one of the reasons why I started this channel, is to help educate people and to show people you can start anywhere. I'm not like, I became politically aware in 2016. Like, I'm learning as I go, and I want to show people how far they can go if they start their own channel. And I know that you are also a proponent of educating the masses. So what is your advice for socialists and even non-socialists who are sick and tired of the current system that we have, for achieving a government that will work for the people and not the wealthy few?
Well, in terms of what each of us can do individually, we need to build a socialist community, right? And in times like this, when people are economically desperate, they need to come together, and they need to depend on each other, and they need to pool their resources, and they need to work together. And while they do that, they need to be studying theory and ideology and coming to understand real Marxism and socialism and apply it in their own lives and build a community centered around those values. And that's really important. We need socialist collective houses. So many young people are struggling with housing. We need young people to start moving in together, have their own room or whatever, rent together, and have a house where you get together and study Marxism every once a week or something. And you have a reading group in your house or something like that. I mean, we need there to be a socialist community, a socialist bloc within U.S. society. And that can be built at a very local level, right? But we need to start having people, build communities and build their lives around this, real understanding of Marxism, socialism, and ideology. That's what you can do on an individual level, start building community. But on a national level, we need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need to get rid of this notion that the government is best that governs least. The government needs to get off our backs. Roosevelt called it do-nothing government, right? If a parent, right, doesn't provide their child with proper clothing or isn't caring for their child, that's called neglect, and the parent can go to jail for it. Well, right now, our government is guilty of criminal neglect, right? Our water is not being properly purified. Our bridges are falling apart. Our schools are crumbling. We have one of the worst educational systems in the Western world. Whole sections of the country are just in shambles. Power plants are falling apart. The country is in utter ruin. And the government of the United States at this time is guilty of criminal neglect. It has failed to achieve its responsibilities. It is not caring for the people. And what we need is a government of action, a strong state based in working people's communities, based in a mass movement, a strong popular government, something like Roosevelt, something like Abraham Lincoln, that could come in there and stand up to these big corporations and start taking economic measures that would improve working people's lives, that would stabilize people's lives, bring them peace, bring them security, make it so they don't have to be afraid about where they're going to pay their bills or how they're going to eat or how they're going to get their kids to school, right? We need popular power. We need state power and that kind of government, a government that would be strong enough to take action to stand up against the rich and powerful, would be a government that depended on the mobilization of millions of Americans and the involvement of millions of Americans in the political process. You go to Venezuela, they have the Bolivarian councils, the Bolivarian circles that are in every city. Cuba, any country that has had a revolutionary government. In China, they've got the Communist Party. It's in every apartment building and every little village. You have to build mass organizations of people who are committed to doing it. And what a communist is something that's been lost. If you say to people, I remember when I went to West Virginia right after Trump won. I was in Wheeling, West Virginia, a steel town, and there was a steel worker. And he said to me, he always voted for Democrats, but this time he voted for Trump. He said, because the Democrats don't care about the working man anymore. The Democrats have turned into a bunch of socialists. Well, the socialists do care about the working man, right? But if you talked to this guy, his idea of what a socialist was a college kid, in a black mask breaking windows. We need people to see socialists as upstanding, patriotic, people in the community who are getting things done and trying to build a better life for their people and for their neighborhood and for their country. Socialists are not chaos creators and bomb throwers. Socialists are upstanding citizens who love their community, love their country and their families so much that they want to get rid of the rule of profits and the greed of international bankers and actually organize society for public good. It is an act of love. It is an act of love for the community. That's what socialism really is. Socialists are community organizers. They are people who want to make a better life. And the goal of socialism is to make the life of average working people better, not worse, right? Mm-hmm. It's about building a better country by getting rid of capitalism, right? I tell people I'm not a socialist because I want to destroy America. I'm a socialist because I want to save America. I want to save America from the horrors of capitalist greed.
Yeah, I found also building online communities very helpful too, where in my Discord at least, we share a lot of information. That's how I found out about you. And we find out about, we connect puzzle pieces. There's certain content creators that are on point with certain issues and others. For example, on civil liberties, one channel may be like really on point and another channel may be really on point with socialism, like yourself. So I found online communities are very helpful for educating each other, and then that information can spread to the family members, and these communities online can grow and grow. What are your thoughts of online communities?
Well, it's great. I mean, I have a community, right? I mean, yeah. Every time I stream, it's the same people. We know each other, and we're very loyal. And that's been a great experience. I wouldn't have gotten through this pandemic if I hadn't built the online community around my YouTube channel. It's great, folks. We don't always agree with each other, but that's okay. But there's kind of a community that has sprouted up around my YouTube channel, and I feel really inspired by it. And we know each other. We have our running jokes. And it's really beautiful. And that building community is the way out of this. And there are different ways to build community, right? Now with new technology, there are different ways of doing it.
Yeah, Caleb Maupin, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation. I love the videos that you put out. I learn a lot from you. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and to everybody else, stay informed.